On the warm Sunday afternoon of the 12th of July 1789, a thin, nervous young man with a stutter climbs onto a wooden café table in the garden of the Palais-Royal, and for the first time in his life the stutter simply vanishes. His name is Camille Desmoulins, a broken, largely unknown journalist, and word has just torn through the crowd that the king has dismissed Jacques Necker, the one minister the people trusted. Desmoulins pulls a pistol from his coat, waves it over the sea of hats and shouts that the dismissal is the tocsin, the alarm bell for a massacre of patriots. He tears a green leaf from one of the chestnut trees overhead and pins it to his hat as a cockade, a badge of hope, and thousands of hands reach up to strip the trees bare. Within 2 days, this ripple of green leaves will become the storming of the Bastille, and you're about to live the days around it, not as a general or a king, but as an ordinary soul on the cobblestones. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the local time is. I love imagining this quiet little map of sleepy people scattered across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn, though wake is a generous word for a night spent on a straw mattress in a rented room 6 flights up under the eaves, where the July heat pools like soup. Paris in 1789 holds around 600,000 people, the second largest city in Europe, and a startling number of them are packed into rooms exactly like yours. The garret is cheap because it is miserable, freezing in winter, roasting now, and reached by a staircase so dark and narrow you have learned to climb it by feel, counting the worn treads with your toes. There is a certain democracy to these tall houses if you squint. The wealthy occupy the grand first floor close to the street. The higher you climb, the poorer you get until you reach people like you at the top, closest to heaven and furthest from anything nice. You rise, splash your face from a cracked jug, and confront the first great fact of your morning, which is the smell. There is no polite way to say this, so I won't try. The streets of Paris are functionally an open sewer. Chamber pots are emptied into the gutter that runs down the middle of each street. Household wastewater joins it, along with mud, horse manure, blood from the butchers, and the runoff of 100 trades. A simple walk can leave you ankle deep in a grey slush that historians, being polite, describe as organic. You're used to it. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing. You genuinely do not notice it anymore, the way you no longer hear a clock you've owned for years. Water is its own daily drama. There is no tap. There is no pipe climbing 6 floors to your door. Instead, there are the water carriers. Porteurs d'eau, sturdy men and women who haul buckets up from the Seine or the public fountains on a wooden yoke across the shoulders, and who will, for a coin, carry them up your ghastly staircase. The trouble is that the Seine into which they dip those buckets is the very same river that receives the sitters. Filth downstream, and often not very far downstream at all. You drink it anyway. Everyone does. You have a vague folk understanding that river water sits wrong, which is why anyone who can afford it drinks watered wine or weak beer instead, and why the cafes of Paris are about to matter so much. Here is a quirky little tidbit to keep in your pocket. The profession of water carrier was so essential and so physically punishing that it became a recognizable Parisian character, a fixture of the streets, and many carriers were immigrants from the Auvergne region, who'd come to the city precisely for this brutal, thankless, muscle-building work. Imagine building your entire livelihood on the fact that a city of 600,000 people cannot get a glass of water without you. There is a strange dignity in it. There is also a very sore back. You dress. Your clothes are wool and linen, rough woven, patched at the elbows, and if you are a working man, you tie on a pair of long trousers rather than the fashionable knee breeches, the culottes of the wealthy. This is not a small detail. Within a few years, the word for people like you, sans-culottes, those without fancy breeches, will become one of the most feared political labels in the world. But this morning it is just what you wear. You're not a symbol yet. You're a person who is hungry and getting hungrier, because the second great fact of your morning is bread. Historians still argue whether the French Revolution was truly caused by ideas, by Liberty and Rousseau and the glittering talk of the salons, or whether it was caused much more simply by the price of a loaf. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic. In the spring of 1789, a 4-pound loaf of bread cost around 14.5 sous. An unskilled labourer earned, on a good day, perhaps 20 or 25 sous. Do that sum slowly, the way your empty stomach is doing it right now. On some days you're handing over 70, 80, even 90% of everything you earn simply to buy the bread that keeps you and your family alive. There is nothing left. Not for meat, not for wine, not for the rent that is already late, not for the shoes with the hole, just bread, and barely. And so you step out into the grey morning light, down the dark stair, into the stink and the noise and the enormous restless animal that is Paris on the edge of something. You do not know it is the edge yet. You only know you are hungry, and that today, like every day, you must go and stand in line. The line for bread is where you learn the real news of the city, long before any newspaper prints it. You join the queue outside the baker's before the shutters are even down, and you are far from first. Ahead of you stretch dozens of your neighbours, porters and seamstresses, laundresses with red raw hands, old men leaning on sticks, mothers with children balanced on their hips, all of them waiting, all of them counting coins in their heads. The queue is quiet in the way that hungry crowds are quiet, which is to say it is not really quiet at all. It hums with a low grinding murmur of grievance. Someone heard that a grain convoy was turned back on the road. Someone else swears the bakers are hoarding flour in their cellars to drive the price higher. None of it may be true. All of it is believed because belief is cheaper than bread and you have more of it. To spare. You must understand how terrifyingly recent all of this is. The winter you have just survived, the winter of 1788 into 1789, was one of the coldest anyone could remember. The Seine froze solid. The great river that carries the city's grain, its firewood, its wine, its everything, turned to a road of ice, and the boats stopped. And the mills that ground the flour stopped with them because the water that turned their wheels was locked in stone. Before the cold, there had been a summer of freak hailstorms that flattened the grain in the fields north of the city. Hailstones the size of eggs smashing a year's harvest flat in an afternoon. 2 disasters, one after the other, stacked like bad cards. And now, in July, you are living inside the consequence. The bakery itself is a small theatre of anxiety. When the shutters finally open, the crowd surges and there is pushing, and a guard or two may appear to keep the peace, which mostly means keeping the desperate from the merely hungry. The baker weighs the loaf. You watch his hands the way a cat watches a bird. A 4-pound loaf, the pain de 4 livres, is the standard, the unit by which your whole economy is measured, and every gram matters. Short weight is not a minor annoyance here. It is a small theft from a family that has nothing to spare, and bakers who cheat have been known to find their windows broken, and their names shouted in the street. Here is your light joke for the morning, and forgive me, because it is a grim one. In Paris in 1789, the surest way to start a riot was not a speech about tyranny or the rights of man. It was a rumour that the price of a loaf had gone up by 2 sous. Kings could be insulted in 100 pamphlets and survive. Bakers could not survive a bad Tuesday. There is a lesson in there about what people actually rise up for, and it is a great deal more flowery than the paintings suggest. You get your loaf, or you get part of one, and you tuck it against your body like something precious because it is. On the walk home you pass the true texture of the city, and I want you to slow down and feel it, because this is the Paris the history books forget. The streets are narrow, medieval, twisting, most of them without pavements, so you share the mud with carts and horses and the occasional swaying carriage of someone important who does not slow down for you. You flatten yourself against a wall of cold stone. You pass a knife grinder throwing sparks, a chestnut seller, a woman selling watercress from a basket, a man mending pots, a barber pulling a tooth on a stool in the open air while the patient grips the seat and pretends to be brave. The noise is constant. Iron wheels on stone, church bells, hawkers crying their wares in a sing-song you've heard since childhood, dogs, and always, underneath it all, voices, thousands of voices, arguing and bargaining and complaining. A real historical detail worth holding on to. Paris in these years was a city almost without numbers on its houses, and with very few street signs anyone could read at speed. So you navigated by landmarks and by trades. You knew the street of the goldsmiths, the sign of the Golden Lion, the corner where the fishwives stood. Your whole map of the world was carried in your head as a chain of sights and smells, not a grid on paper. A stranger dropped into your neighbourhood could be genuinely, hopelessly lost within 100 yards, swallowed by a maze that you could run blindfolded. Historians still argue whether the ordinary Parisian of 1789 truly understood the politics swirling above their heads, the Estates General, the deadlock at Versailles, the noble privileges, the tangle of debt that had bankrupted the crown, or whether most people simply felt the pressure of it, the way you feel a storm in your knees before you see the clouds. The truth is probably both. You cannot read the king's ledgers, but you can read the price chalked on the baker's board, and you can read the faces in the queue, and lately those faces have been changing from tired to something harder and more awake. You climb your dark staircase again, loaf in hand, and for a moment, safe in your terrible little room with the July heat pressing down, you allow yourself the smallest relief. You have bread today. Whatever else the enormous groaning city decides to do to itself this week, you have bread today. You break off a piece and eat it slowly, making it last, and through the small window you can hear, drifting up from the streets below, the first uncertain sounds of a crowd beginning to gather somewhere off toward the gardens, a sound that will define the days to come. But you cannot stay in your room because a room does not earn wages, and so you go back down into the day to find work. And here you meet the third great fact of Parisian life, which is that the city runs on an astonishing, dizzying variety of small trades. Paris is not a city of factories, it is a city of hands. On a single short street you might pass a dozen guilds worth of skill, cobblers and glovers, hatters and dyers, cabinet makers whose glue pots steam in doorways, gilders, engravers, wig makers powdering a client white, and the endless small armies of women who sew and mend and wash. You belong to one of these trades, or you scrape by on the edges of several, taking whatever the day offers. Let us say, for tonight, that you are a journeyman in one of the finer crafts, because I want to show you a specific and very real Parisian tragedy that had already happened a few months. Before this July, cast your mind back to April, to the eastern edge of the city, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a rough, proud, working district packed with furniture makers and their apprentices. There stood the manufactory of Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, a genuinely successful man who made luxury wallpaper, beautiful, expensive stuff, printed for the homes of the rich, and who employed around 300 well-paid workers. Réveillon was not, by the standards of his day, a villain. He had risen from nothing himself. But at a meeting of his local electoral district in late April, he said something about the cost of production and wages that, torn from its context and passed mouth to mouth through the hungry streets, curdled into a rumour that this rich man wanted to cut the workers' pay to a starvation wage. You must picture how such a rumour lands in a district where a loaf already eats 9/10 of a day's earnings. It does not land as an argument. It lands as a spark on dry straw. On the 26th of April, and worse on the 28th, crowds gathered and marched, and then stopped marching and started breaking. They stormed Réveillon's grand house, dragged his furniture into the street, smashed it, looted his wine cellar, and set the whole lot ablaze. The man himself escaped over a back wall and fled the city, ruined, and then the soldiers came, and they fired into the crowd, and when the smoke cleared, perhaps 25 people lay dead in the faubourg, maybe more. The counts were never certain, because the poor were not always carefully counted. Here is the quirky, human, faintly unbearable detail. Réveillon's wallpaper was so admired that the Montgolfier brothers had chosen his workshop only a few years earlier to help construct the great decorated balloon in which the first passengers, a sheep, a duck, and a rooster, rose into the French sky. The same skilled hands that had helped humanity first leave the ground were now smashing furniture in the street because they could not afford to eat. Progress and starvation, working in the very same building. If you wanted a single image for the contradictions of 1789, you could do worse than that ruined, beautiful, fire-blackened house. And here is a light joke, because you need one after that. The mob, having broken into the wine cellar, is said to have gotten thoroughly, catastrophically drunk on the vintages of the very man they were protesting, which rather blunted the revolutionary edge of the afternoon and made the soldiers' work, sadly, much easier. Even history's tragedies contain a hiccup or two. You did not throw a stone that April day, or perhaps you did, and you do not talk about it. But you felt the Réveillon riots the way the whole city felt them, as proof that the ground had shifted, that the old bargain, in which the poor suffered quietly and the rich ignored them politely, had somehow invisibly expired. People were still angry, and now it was July, and the anger had not gone anywhere, It had only warmed. Historians still argue whether the Réveillon riots were a true beginning of the revolution, or merely a bread riot that happened to come first, a spasm of hunger with no politics behind it. The people who marched left few of their own words behind, so we are left guessing at what was in their heads. Perhaps they wanted rights, perhaps they only wanted supper. Perhaps, as is usually the case with human beings, they wanted both at once and could not have told you where one ended and the other began. You find your work, such as it is, and you bend to it for the long hours of the day because the light is free and the candles are not. And a craftsman works while the sun allows. Your hands know the motions without your mind's help, the plane, the needle, the awl, the brush, and as they move, your ears stay tuned to the street because the street is where the weather of the city is reported. And all through this warm second week of July, the street has been reporting a change in pressure. Soldiers, foreign soldiers, German and Swiss mercenaries in the king's pay, are being moved into positions around Paris. Everyone has seen them. Everyone has a theory. And the theories, passed hand to hand like the Réveillon rumour before them, are curdling once again into something with a sharp and dangerous edge. You finish your work as the light goes amber and long. You are paid, if you're lucky, in small coins that will be gone by morning. And instead of climbing straight back up to your stifling room, tonight you do what more and more Parisians are doing in these strange charged evenings. You turn your feet toward the one place in the whole city where a poor man can stand, shoulder to shoulder with the news itself. You turn toward the Palais-Royal. The Palais-Royal is unlike anywhere else in Paris, and to understand the days that are coming, you must first understand this remarkable, glittering, slightly disreputable place, because it is the beating heart of everything. It belongs to the Duke of Orleans, a cousin of the king, and a man with his own tangled ambitions. A few years earlier, needing money, the Duke had done something clever and faintly scandalous. He had built rows of elegant shops and cafes in arcades around the garden of his own palace, and rented them out. The result is the closest thing the 18th century has to a shopping mall, a place of colonnades and lamplight where you can buy a hat, a book, a coffee, a meal, a game of cards, or company of a kind your grandmother would not approve of, all in one glittering rectangle. And crucially, this is the detail that changes history. Because the Palais-Royal is private property belonging to a prince of the blood, the king's police cannot freely enter it. It is a loophole the size of a garden. Inside these arcades, men can say things aloud that would get them arrested one street over. Pamphlets that could not be legally sold are stacked on tables. Speakers climb onto chairs and denounce ministers by name. The cafés, the Café de Foire, the Café du Caveau, fill with lawyers and journalists and clerks and idlers, all talking, arguing, reading the latest scandal sheet aloud to those who cannot read it themselves. It is a furnace of words, and in the summer of 1789 the words are getting hotter by the day. You wander in beneath the arcades as the lamps are being lit, and the sheer sensory abundance of the place hits you after the mud and stink of the ordinary streets. Here the ground is clean. Here there is music from somewhere, and the smell of real coffee and roasting meat, and perfume trailing off the wrist of a woman who costs more than you earn in a month. Gamblers hunch over tables upstairs. Pickpockets work the crowd with professional care, so keep your hand near your coin. Booksellers hawk the day's pamphlets, some of them so freshly printed the ink smears on your thumb. And everywhere, there is talk, the low roar of hundreds of conversations all circling the same few subjects. The price of bread, the deadlock at Versailles, the soldiers ringing the city, and the fate of Necker. Let me give you the real historical weight of that name, because you keep hearing it shouted. Jacques Necker is the king's finance minister, a Swiss Protestant banker, and to the ordinary people of Paris he is something close to a folk hero. The one man at the top who seems to be on their side, who understands money, who might yet find a way to feed them. This is probably too much faith to put in any minister, but faith is what a hungry city runs on. So when the news arrives, and it arrives here, in the Palais-Royal faster than anywhere else, that the king has dismissed Necker and sent him away, it lands like the Réveillon rumour did, but 1,000 times larger. If Necker is gone, the reasoning runs, then the king means to use those foreign soldiers. If the soldiers are for anything, they are for us. A massacre is coming. Here is a genuinely quirky tidbit about this hothouse of revolution. The Palais-Royal was also, simultaneously, the single most notorious pickup spot in all of Europe, a place of open prostitution and gambling dens, so the same garden that incubated the loftiest ideals of liberty and the rights of man was also where you went to lose your wages at cards and catch something regrettable. The cradle of freedom and the sink of vice shared an address. Revolutions, it turns out, are rarely born in tidy, respectable rooms, and a light joke, since the evening allows it, the food at some of the Palais-Royal cafes was so celebrated that you could argue, only half in jest, that the French Revolution was plotted by men who had just eaten extremely well and were therefore in the perfect mood to reorganize the universe. There is nothing quite so dangerous as an intelligent, underemployed young man with a full stomach, a coffee and a grievance. It is into exactly this crowd, on the 12th of July, that our stuttering young journalist Camille Desmoulins will leap onto his table. But that is tomorrow's scene, or nearly. Tonight you simply stand in the throng and let the talk wash over you, and you feel something you have not felt in your whole hungry life. The feeling of being part of something enormous, something with a will of its own, a crowd that is beginning to suspect its own strength. You're not a symbol, you're not a soldier, but standing here, packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers who are all afraid and all angry about the very same things, you feel for the first time less alone. Historians still argue whether the Duke of Orleans deliberately fanned these flames beneath his own arcades, funding the pamphlets and the orators to weaken his royal cousin and perhaps put himself on the throne, or whether he simply built a mall and lost control of it. The evidence points in every direction at once, which is usually a sign that the truth is complicated and a little embarrassing for everyone involved. Whatever the Duke intended, the garden did its work, and as the lamps burn down and the crowd refuses to thin, you finally turn for home, your head full of names and fears, walking back through the darkening streets toward another short and sweating night beneath the eaves. You do not sleep well, and neither does the city. The heat is part of it, but only part. All through the short summer night the streets never fully empty. There are footsteps and voices, and once, far off, the sound of a bell rung at an hour when no honest bell should ring. When the grey light finally seeps under your door, that Sunday morning of the 12th of July, you rise with a strange tightness in your chest. The feeling of a day that has already decided to be different. You do not go to work. Almost no one goes to work. Without quite agreeing to it, the whole of Paris seems to be drifting by instinct toward the gardens of the Palais-Royal, and you drift with it. By afternoon, the crowd there is enormous, denser than you have ever seen it, a single restless body filling the garden and spilling out under the arcades. The news of Necker's dismissal has arrived overnight and hardened into certainty, and the certainty has a face now. Fear. Men are saying openly that the foreign regiments will march into the city, tonight, and cut the people down in the streets. And it is into this crush of frightened, furious Parisians that a slight young man with untidy dark hair pushes his way to a café table, climbs up, and changes his own life and yours in the space of a few sentences. I told you about Camille Desmoulins at the very start of our night together, and now here he is again, in the flesh, and I want you to really see him, because he's so improbable a hero. He is 29, a failed lawyer because his stammer made him useless in a courtroom, poor, in love with a woman whose family thinks him beneath her, and almost entirely unknown. And yet when he leaps onto that table and opens his mouth, the stammer that has crippled him all his life simply is not there. The words pour out clean and burning. "To arms!" he cries. He tells them Necker's fall is the signal for a St. Bartholomew's massacre of patriots, invoking the old horror of a night when Catholics slaughtered Protestants in these very streets. He waves a pistol, and then he does the thing that is remembered. He calls on the crowd to take up a cockade, a badge so they may know one another as brothers, and he snatches a green leaf from a chestnut tree above him and fixes it to his hat. The gesture is electric. Green is the colour of hope, and in an instant the crowd is stripping the trees, thousands of hands pulling down leaves, pinning green to every hat and buttonhole, until the garden looks as though a strange spring has burst out of the summer. Here is a small, true, almost comic wrinkle that historians love. Green was very briefly a disaster as a revolutionary colour, because someone quickly pointed out that green was also the livery of the Comte d'Artois, the king's reactionary brother, one of the most hated men in France. You cannot rally against tyranny wearing the tyrant's own colours. So within a day the green cockade is thrown down and replaced by the blue and red of the city of Paris, the colours that, with a stripe of royal white a day later, become the tricolour flag that the world still knows. Let me hand you the quirky tidbit and the laugh together, because they are the same thing. The colour scheme of revolutionary France, one of the most powerful political symbols in human history, was essentially chosen by trial and error over a couple of days by a mob that first grabbed the nearest leaves off a tree and then had to sheepishly change the whole plan, when someone realised they'd accidentally coordinated their outfits with the villain. The birth of a flag, brought to you by a committee of the hungry, the frightened, and the improvising. Desmoulins climbs down, hoarse and shaking, half astonished at what he has done. He will spend the rest of his short life as a famous man because of these. Few minutes, and he will die on the guillotine only 5 years later, devoured by the very revolution he helped to summon. But that grief belongs to another night. For now the crowd is moving, pouring out of the Palais-Royal and into the streets, and you are moving with it, swept along on a current far too strong to fight even if you wanted to. Bells begin to ring across the city, the tocsin, the alarm, one steeple taking it up from another until the whole sky rattles. Historians still argue whether Desmoulins truly ignited the crowd, or whether he merely gave voice to something already about to explode, whether he lit the fire or simply happened to be the man standing on the table when the powder went off. It is an old debate about all revolutions, whether great events are made by individuals or by tides. The honest answer is that we cannot cleanly separate the two, any more than you can separate the spark from the dry grass and say which one caused the field to burn. That night, the mood in the streets curdles from fear into action. Crowds break into a wax museum and carry off the busts of Necker and the Duke of Orleans, parading these strange pale heads through the streets by torchlight as if they were saints in a religious procession, a detail so odd you would not believe it if the records did not insist upon it. And near the Place Vendôme, this procession meets a charge of royal cavalry, the dreaded German cavalry of the Royal Allemand Regiment. Sabres out, people fall. The rumour of massacre, so long feared, has finally drawn its first real blood, and the news of it races through Paris faster than any horse, hardening every heart it touches. Now the city arms itself and you arm yourself with it, because the alternative, waiting quietly in your garret for foreign soldiers to decide your fate, has become unthinkable. All through the night of the 12th and into the strange, sleepless day of the 13th, Paris transforms itself from a collection of frightened individuals into something with a single, searching purpose: weapons. Everyone needs weapons. The people have decided, without any single person deciding it, that they will not be slaughtered like the crowd at Réveillon, and to avoid that they need muskets, powder, pikes, anything with an edge or a bang. But first, in the small dark hours, the city turns its fury on something closer and more hated than any distant king: the customs wall. You may not know this detail, and it is one of my favourites because it explains so much about the ordinary Parisian's rage. Ringing the whole of Paris was a tall wall, recently built, called the Wall of the Farmers General, and its purpose was purely to tax. Every cartload of wine, grain, firewood and food that entered the city was stopped at a gate, a barrier, and taxed, which meant that everything you bought cost more precisely because of this wall. The Parisians had a bitter little rhyme about it, a pun that runs, roughly, "The wall walling Paris makes Paris murmur." On the night of the 12th and 13th, that murmur becomes a roar, and the crowds burn the customs gates, 40 of them or more, torching the hated toll houses so that food might flow into the city untaxed. Before a single shot is fired at the Bastille, the people have already struck at the thing that made them poor at the point of sale. Picture the scene, and hold it, because it is pure and strange. Ordinary men and women by the light of the very toll houses they are burning, hauling barrels of untaxed wine into the streets, cheering as the flames climb, feeling for one wild night that the invisible cage around their lives has been broken open. Some of them are drunk, many of them are simply exhausted and giddy with fear. All of them are, for the moment, free of the taxman, and the joy of that is real even as the smoke stains the dawn. By morning, cooler heads try to seize the reins of the chaos. The city's respectable men, the electors who had chosen Paris's delegates to the Estates General, gather at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, and hastily create a citizens' militia to keep order, both against the king's soldiers and frankly against the looting poor whom the middle classes fear almost as much. This militia will soon be called the National Guard. It needs a uniform mark, and it settles on a cockade of blue and red, the colours of Paris, which is how those green leaves of yesterday are so quickly forgotten. The militia needs men, tens of thousands of them, and it needs muskets it does not have. And so the great hunt for weapons that will end at the Bastille truly begins. Here is a light joke to carry through the smoke. The newly formed militia was so desperately short of real muskets that many of its first soldiers marched out to defend the liberty of France, armed with kitchen knives lashed to broom handles, fencing foils, ancient rusted swords pulled off decorative walls, and in more than one case, nothing but a stout stick and a great deal of enthusiasm. The most consequential armed uprising in modern history began, in large part, as several thousand furious people waving the contents of their sheds. You spend the 13th on your feet, moving with the crowds, and everywhere the question is the same: where are the guns? Rumours fly. There are weapons at this convent, powder at that monastery, muskets stored here or there. Some of the rumours are true and some are not, but the crowd tests each one with its own restless body, surging from place to place across the city. It is exhausting and frightening, and in a way you feel guilty admitting exhilarating, because for the first time in your life, the city belongs to you and people like you, and the men who usually give the orders are nowhere to be seen, or are hiding behind their shutters, watching you pass. A real and telling detail. Through all of this, the crowd is not mostly a mindless mob, whatever frightened aristocrats later claimed. It posts guards. It protects property from thieves, sometimes hanging looters on the spot to prove the uprising is not mere robbery. It organises, argues, sends messengers, forms lines. There is terror in it, yes, and there will be horror before the week is out. But there is also a fierce, improvised discipline, the discipline of people who know that if they are seen as a criminal rabble, they will be shot as one. Historians still argue whether the storming of the Bastille that came the next day was a planned military objective or an accident of the search for gunpowder, whether the crowd set out to topple, a symbol of tyranny, or simply went looking for the powder they knew was stored inside its walls and got into a fight they could not stop. The evidence, honestly, favours the powder. The Bastille was toppled less as a grand statement and more as a very large ammunition depot that would not open its doors. But history has a way of turning accidents into symbols after the fact, and by the next evening no one would remember, or want to remember, that the whole thing began with the practical, unglamorous need for something to load the guns with. Night falls again on a city that has not slept in 2 days, and you finally stumble home for a few hours, your eyes stinging with smoke, your ears still ringing with bells, knowing without being told that tomorrow will be the day the whole world remembers. The 14th of July dawns pale and already warm, and you wake with the rest of the city into a morning that feels less like a day and more like the held breath before a plunge. There is no bread queue this morning, or if there is, no one is standing in it, because the whole vast machinery of ordinary life has simply stopped. The workshops are shut, the markets are half empty. The only business in Paris today is the business of arming, and the crowds gather again with the grim, purposeful energy of people who have decided something in their sleep. The word passes from mouth to mouth and pulls the crowd across the river, to the southwest, to a great domed building you have known your whole life as a place of old soldiers, the Hôtel des Invalides, the Veterans' Hospital founded by the old king to house the wounded and the aged of his wars. In its cellars, everyone now says, are stored muskets. Thousands upon thousands of them, and the crowd wants them. You go too, carried in the human tide across the bridges, and by mid-morning you are part of a mass of perhaps tens of thousands, pressing up against the walls and gates of the Invalides. The governor there hesitates, negotiates, stalls, and it does him no good because the crowd will not be stalled. They pour over the walls and into the courtyards, and they find the cellars, and there, stacked in the cool dark, are the muskets. Some 28 to 30,000 of them, a river of iron and wood. Imagine the roar as the first ones are hauled up into the light and passed hand over hand into the crowd. In a single morning, a Parisian mob that yesterday was waving broom handles has become one of the best armed forces in France. Old cannon are dragged out too. The city bristles, and here is the cruel joke at the centre of the whole day, the pivot on which everything turns. There is almost no gunpowder at the Invalides, muskets by the tens of thousands, and barely anything to fire from them. A musket without powder is an awkward, expensive club. All those guns and the one thing that makes them deadly is missing, and everyone knows, because it is common knowledge exactly where the powder went. Only days earlier, the authorities had moved the city's stores of gunpowder for safekeeping into the strongest fortress in Paris. The one place they were sure no mob could ever break, the Bastille. Do you feel how the day is now shaped like an arrow, and how it points at one target? The crowd does not need a philosopher to explain the next step. 30,000 muskets and no powder, and a fortress across the city stuffed with powder and guarded by a governor who has already nervously drawn up his drawbridges. The march to the Bastille is not, in this moment, an act of grand symbolism. It is arithmetic. It is thirst. The people have the guns. The powder is over there, therefore they go over there. History will dress the afternoon in the robes of liberty afterward, and it will not be entirely wrong to do so. But on the ground, in the heat, in your own pounding chest, the reason is as plain and practical as an empty flask beside a well. Let me give you a genuine historical detail about the invalides that most people never hear. The old veterans housed inside, the very men who were supposed to guard those cellars, largely refused to fight the crowd. Ordered to defend the muskets, they dawdled, unscrewed their weapons, sabotaged the defence from within, because these were old soldiers of France. Poor men themselves, and they had no stomach for firing on a hungry crowd that looked a great deal like the families they had left behind. All through these days you see this again and again, the king's forces melting, hesitating, defecting, because the line between the soldier and the citizen was never as thick as the powerful liked. To believe, a quirky tidbit to lighten the load, among the vast crowd that seized the Invalides and then set off for the Bastille were a great many women, and market women in particular, who were among the fiercest and most organised participants in these July days, a fact that scandalised the polite pamphleteers, who did not know quite how to describe an uprising in which the fishwives of Les Halles were very much in the front rank rather than safely at home. The revolution, from its first hours, was never only a matter of men, and a light joke, because the arrow is about to fly and you will want to have smiled first. The single most famous fortress storming in world history was launched fundamentally because a very large number of people had just acquired 30,000 guns and then discovered, to their collective annoyance, that they had forgotten to buy bullets. If ever there was proof that history is made by ordinary human oversight, as much as by grand design, it is the fact that the Bastille fell essentially over a citywide ammunition shortage. Historians still argue whether the crowd that set out for the Bastille truly grasped what a titanic thing it was about to attempt, or whether it simply followed the powder without weighing the odds, the way water follows a slope without deciding to. Some of those marching surely dreamed of toppling a tyrant's dungeon. Others just wanted to load their new muskets before nightfall in case the Germans came. Both walked in the same direction, in the same dust, and by the end of the day both would be able to say, truthfully and forever, that they had been there. You fall in among them, your mouth dry, the sun climbing, and you turn your face east, toward the 8 great towers rising over the rooftops. Before those towers swallow the afternoon, let me walk you slowly around the Bastille itself. This thing you are marching toward, because you have lived in its shadow your whole life and have never once been inside, and almost no one you know has either. That is precisely the point of it. The Bastille is a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of Paris, more than 4 centuries old, built during an earlier war to guard a city gate, and it looks exactly as forbidding as its reputation. 8 round towers of pale stone, some 30 metres high, joined by walls just as tall and nearly as thick. The whole squat monster surrounded by a wide dry moat and reached only by drawbridges. It broods over the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, that same rough working district that rioted for Réveillon in April. Like a stone warning that has stood so long people have half stopped seeing it. For generations the Bastille has been not just a fortress but a prison, and not an ordinary prison. It is where the king could send a man by a simple sealed letter. A lettre de cachet with no trial, no charge read aloud, no end date named. A private royal order that could make a person vanish behind these walls at the request of a family. Wanting to hush up a scandal or a minister wanting an enemy gone. That power, more than the stone, is what makes the Bastille hated. It is the physical fact of arbitrary power, a building you can point at, and to the ordinary Parisian it means one terrible thing, that you can be swallowed whole by the state, and no one will ever have to explain why. And yet, here is where the legend and the reality begin their long, awkward dance. By July of 1789 the Bastille is very nearly empty and already quietly doomed. The government has known for years that it is enormously expensive to maintain and barely used, and there are actual plans on paper to demolish it and replace it with a public square. On this famous morning it holds a garrison of only about 80 or 90 old soldiers, the pensioners called invalides, stiffened by around 30 Swiss guards, and, this is the detail that always deflates the schoolbook drama, exactly 7 prisoners. 7. Not a dungeon groaning with martyrs of liberty, but 7 men. 4 ordinary forgers locked up for counterfeiting, 2 men held as insane, and 1 aristocratic black sheep imprisoned at his own family's request for scandalous behaviour. That is the entire population of tyranny's great dungeon on the day it falls. Here is your quirky, almost unbearable tidbit. Among the prisoners recently held in the Bastille, and moved out only a week and a half before the storming, was the Marquis de Sade, the notorious writer, who in early July had stood at his cell window and bellowed through an improvised megaphone. Some say a funnel or a pipe he used to drain his slops, that the guards were murdering prisoners inside, trying to whip up the crowd below. He was transferred out for causing trouble on the 2nd of July, which means the single most infamous inmate of the Bastille missed its fall by less than 2 weeks, and spent the rest of his life presumably furious about the timing. History's sense of comedy is merciless, and a light joke, freely given. The Bastille, the dread symbol of royal oppression whose fall would be celebrated by an entire nation forever after, was on the day of its storming a crumbling, half-abandoned, money-losing white elephant that the government was already trying to figure out how to knock down, guarded by pensioners and holding 7 of the least romantic prisoners imaginable. The people did not storm the beating heart of tyranny so much as they stormed its neglected, overpriced, nearly vacant storage unit, which happened, crucially, to be full of gunpowder. But none of that deflation is visible from where you stand in the crowd this afternoon, and none of it makes the thing you're about to do one bit less dangerous, because whatever the Bastille has become on paper, its walls are still real, its cannon are still real, and the governor's men can still kill you very easily from behind 30 metres of stone. Symbolism does not stop a musket ball. The garrison may be old, but old men with muskets on a high wall are more than a match for a crowd in an open street, and everyone gathering before those towers knows it in the pit of their stomach. The man in command inside is Bernard-René de Launay, and here is one last true and human detail before the shooting starts. De Launay was born inside the Bastille. His father was governor before him, and he had, quite literally, spent his entire life within or beside these walls. On this day, the fortress that had been his whole world would become his tomb, and the crowd that would kill him was even now assembling in the streets below, sweating in the July sun, 30,000 muskets among them and no powder, staring up at the drawbridges he had just ordered raised. Historians still argue whether de Launay was a cruel jailer or simply an unlucky, indecisive man caught in an impossible position, ordered to hold a fortress he knew could not really be defended against his own countrymen, with no clear instructions from a government that had effectively abandoned him. The records let you read him either way. What is certain is that within a few hours he would face a choice no manual had prepared him for, and that he would, in the end, make it badly, as perhaps any of us might, high on a doomed wall with the whole roaring city rising toward the gate. The afternoon of the 14th begins not with a battle but with a negotiation, which is the thing the paintings never show, because a delegation politely asking a governor for gunpowder does not make for stirring art. In the early afternoon, a group of representatives from the city crosses the drawbridge under a flag of truce and is invited inside to talk. De Launay receives them, even offers them refreshment, and the two sides haggle. The people want the powder and the cannon pointed down at the streets pulled back. De Launay wants assurances he will not simply be overrun. The delegates are inside for what feels to the crowd like an eternity, and the crowd outside, unable to see what is happening, grows convinced their representatives have been seized or killed. Fear does the rest. At some point in the early afternoon, a few bold men clamber onto the roof of a perfume seller's shop that abuts the outer courtyard, drop into the undefended outer court and hack down the chains of the first drawbridge. It crashes down and the crowd surges across into the outer courtyard, and now everyone is far too close, and the mood is far too hot, and the careful negotiation collapses into chaos. Shots ring out. To this day, no one can say for certain who fired first. The defenders swear the crowd shot at them. The crowd swore the garrison had lured them in to slaughter them, and both sides believed it utterly. From that first uncertain crack, the afternoon becomes a battle, and it is a real battle, not a parade. The garrison, old men or not, holds the high ground behind 30 metres of stone, and they have powder, and they have cannon, and they use them. From the towers they fire down into the packed courtyard, and the crowd, jammed into a killing ground with nowhere to hide, is cut down in rows. This is the crucial, sobering fact that the celebrations always soften. The storming of the Bastille was genuinely bloody, and nearly all of the blood was the people's. By the end of the day, close to 100 of the attackers lie dead, perhaps 98, and many more are wounded while the defenders lose only one man in the fighting itself. You are in that courtyard, pressed against a wall, deafened, choking on smoke, watching people you were laughing with an hour ago fall and not get up, and there is no glory in it at all. Only noise and terror, and the animal need to survive the next minute. For hours it hangs in the balance, and by every rule of war the crowd should fail. Because untrained citizens in the open do not take stone fortresses from soldiers who hold the walls. What changes everything is the arrival of men who know war. Companies of the French Guards, royal soldiers who have gone over to the people, march up with real discipline and, more importantly, with real cannon, dragged all the way from the Invalides. Among them are two determined veterans, Pierre-Augustin Hulin and Jacob Elie, who impose a rough order on the chaos and wheel the heavy guns into position, aiming them squarely at the great inner drawbridge. Now the arithmetic has flipped. Now it is the fortress that faces artillery, and the old men on the walls who must do the calculating. Here is a light joke amid the smoke, and it is true. One of the cannon the people used to threaten the mighty Bastille into surrender was a beautiful, ornamental piece of Siamese origin, a diplomatic gift, more accustomed to standing decoratively than to firing in anger. So the great fortress of the French crown was in part stared down by a ceremonial. Cannon borrowed from a museum piece collection. The whole day is like this. Enormous consequences balanced on absurd, improvised, half-comic details. A quirky tidbit worth keeping. The conquerors of the Bastille, the vainqueurs de la Bastille, were later officially counted and honoured, and the list runs to fewer than 1,000 names. Far, far smaller than the sea of humanity that legend imagines, and full of ordinary tradesmen, a cobbler here, a cabinet maker there, a wine merchant, a hatter, the everyday people of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, who happen to be brave or foolish or desperate enough to press to the front. You could well be one of them, your name someday inked onto a list you cannot read, remembered by a nation for a single sweating afternoon. Inside the fortress, Delaunay faces his impossible choice. With cannon now trained on his gate and no hope of relief coming, no royal army is riding to save him. No orders arrive, the government has left him utterly alone. He must decide whether to fight to the end and be blown apart, or surrender to a crowd he has just spent hours killing and hope for mercy he has every reason to doubt. For one terrible moment he considers the third option. He seizes a lit match and moves toward the fortress's own powder magazine, meaning to blow the Bastille, himself, his garrison, and much of the surrounding neighbourhood to the sky rather than surrender. Two of his own men physically stop him, wresting the match from his hand. Historians still argue whether Delaunay ever truly meant to detonate the magazine, or whether it was a desperate bluff, a dying man's threat to win better terms, and we will never know, because the men who could tell us are long dust, and the fortress that held the answer was pulled down stone by stone within the year. What we do know is that the threat, real or bluffed, changed nothing in the end. The choice was already made for him by the cannon at the gate and the sea of the furious below. And so, as the long afternoon bleeds toward evening, Delaunay makes his decision and orders the great inner drawbridge lowered and opens the Bastille to the people of Paris. The drawbridge comes down, and the crowd pours across it into the courtyard of the Bastille, and for one strange, suspended moment there is something almost like awe, because these are ordinary people standing inside the one place they were never, ever meant to stand. They have taken the untakeable. They spread through the courtyards and up into the towers, and they search for the martyrs they are certain must be chained in the deepest cells, and they find, instead, 7 bewildered prisoners blinking in the sudden light, 4 forgers, 2 madmen, 1 disgraced nobleman. The rescuers are almost disappointed, but they hoist the freed men onto their shoulders anyway and carry them out as living trophies, symbols pressed into service whether they suit the role or not. One of the men held as insane, a long-bearded fellow convinced he was Julius Caesar, is paraded through the streets to great cheering, which tells you almost everything about how myth and muddle walk arm in arm on days like this. But the mood in the courtyard is not gentle for long, because nearly 100 of the crowd lie dead, and the living know exactly whom to blame. Delaunay is seized. His surrender terms, whatever he imagined they were, evaporate the moment he steps into the open among the families of the men his cannon killed. He is dragged out of the fortress and through the streets toward the Hôtel de Ville, kicked and beaten and spat upon the whole way, a governor born inside those walls now hauled through the city by the people who lived in their shadow. What happens next is the part the celebrations look away from, and I will tell it plainly but gently because you should know the whole shape of the day, the ugliness as well as the triumph. Near the Hôtel de Ville, tormented and perhaps wishing only to end it, Delaunay lashes out and kicks a man in the crowd, an unemployed cook named Denon. The records say, and the crowd falls on him. He is stabbed and shot and killed, and then, in a horror that would echo through all the years to come, his head is sawn from his body and raised on a pike, and carried through the streets of Paris in grim procession. He's not the only one. The merchant provost of the city, Jacques de Flesselles, blamed for sending the people to empty alms caches as a cruel joke, is shot dead on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville, and his head too goes up on a pike. The heads on pikes will become a recurring nightmare of the Revolution, and they begin here, on this first famous day, so that you understand from the very start that this thing you have joined is not a pageant. It is a rising of the desperate, and the desperate, pushed far enough, are capable of both extraordinary courage and genuine horror, sometimes in the same hour, sometimes in the same person. Let me give you the human detail that makes it real rather than merely gruesome. The man who did the actual cutting, Desnot, later insisted he had not wanted to do it, that he had been handed the knife and pressed to it by the mob. And there is something painfully true in that image. An ordinary cook, not a monster, swept past the edge of what he ever meant to do by a crowd whose fury had become a current no single person could stand against. That is how atrocities usually happen. Not through a city full of villains, but through ordinary frightened people who, for one unbearable stretch of hours, stop being individuals and become a mob. Here is a quirky tidbit to steady you. The actual key to the Bastille, the great iron key to its main gate, survives to this day, but not in France. The revolutionaries gave it as a gift through a mutual friend to George Washington, as a token that the American Revolution had inspired the French one, and that heavy old key now hangs on a wall at Mount Vernon in Virginia, thousands of miles from the fortress it once locked, a strange little souvenir of one afternoon's violence travelling quietly across an ocean into a museum, and a gentle joke, because you have earned one after that dark passage. Within days of the fall, an enterprising man named Pierre-François Palais took charge of demolishing the Bastille and immediately grasped that he was sitting on the greatest souvenir opportunity in history. He had the fortress's stones carved into little models of the Bastille itself and sold them across France as patriotic keepsakes, so that citizens could own a tiny stone Bastille made from the real Bastille, arguably the world's first mass-produced political merchandise, hawked before the rubble had even stopped smoking. The gift shop, it turns out, is older than you think. Historians still argue whether the storming of the Bastille deserves its towering place in memory at all, given how small the garrison was, how few the prisoners, how nearly the whole thing turned on gunpowder rather than principle, or whether the meaning the people poured into it afterward is itself the real historical fact, more important than the modest military reality. My own quiet view, for what it is worth at this late and sleepy hour, is that both are true at once. The event was smaller than the legend, and the legend was truer than the event, because what the people believed they had done on the 14th of July shaped everything they did next, and belief, as we said at the very beginning of our night, is what a city runs on. You walk home in the dark past bonfires and singing and the occasional terrible shadow of a pike, and you know without anyone telling you that the world you woke up in this morning is already gone. The morning after is quiet in a way that unsettles you more than the noise ever did. You wake late, aching, your hands raw, and for a moment you cannot remember why the light feels wrong, and then it comes back, all of it, and you lie still on your straw and listen to a city that does not yet know what it has become. Far off at Versailles, the king is only now learning what happened. There is a famous exchange, probably tidied up in the retelling but too good to leave out, in which Louis XVI, told of the Bastille's fall, asks, "Is it a revolt? and the courtier who brings the news answers, "No, sire, it is a revolution." Whether those exact words were ever spoken, they capture the truth of the morning perfectly. Something has crossed a line from which there is no walking back. The king, to his credit or his weakness depending on how you read him, does not send the army. He pulls the troops back from Paris. He recalls Necker, the dismissed minister whose fall started it all, and a few days later he does something no French king has ever done. He comes to Paris, to the Hôtel de Ville, and there, before the people, he accepts from the new mayor a cockade in the colours of the city, red and blue. Someone, the story credits the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American War and now commander of the new National Guard, adds the royal white between them. And the three colours together become the tricolour, the badge of the new France worn by the king himself. For a brief, shining, entirely false moment, it looks as though the storm has passed and a gentler settlement has been reached. You pin the blue, white and red to your own hat. Because everyone does now, and to be seen without a cockade in these days is to invite suspicion or worse. Here is a quirky and slightly alarming tidbit. The cockade very quickly became compulsory in spirit long before it was compulsory in law, so that a well-dressed traveller who forgot to wear one might be stopped, questioned and jostled by ordinary citizens who had appointed themselves guardians of the revolution, and woe betide the aristocrat caught sneering at the little rosette of ribbon. Overnight, a scrap of coloured cloth became the difference between a friend and a suspect. Life astonishingly resumes. The bread must still be bought. The queue forms again. The water carriers heave their buckets up the same dark stairs. This is the thing no one tells you about living through history, that even in the middle of it, most of your hours are still spent on the small business of staying alive, and the great events happen in the gaps between chores. You go back to your trade, the markets reopen, the theatres, after a nervous pause, light their lamps again, but everything is subtly, permanently altered, the way a room looks different after you have moved one heavy piece of furniture. You cannot always say what changed, only that nothing sits quite where it did. The National Guard now patrols the streets in their new uniforms, ordinary citizens turned soldiers, and their presence is a daily reminder that the city for now polices itself. The customs gates that burned are not rebuilt in a hurry. Pamphlets multiply like summer flies, cheaper and bolder than ever, because the old censorship has effectively collapsed and anyone with a press and an opinion is suddenly a publisher. You cannot read most of them, but you can hear them, read aloud on every corner, and the sheer volume of words, arguments, accusations, dreams, lies, is intoxicating and exhausting in equal measure. The whole city has become a conversation that never stops talking, a light joke for the strange new normal. In the weeks after the Bastille fell, so many Parisians rushed to buy little carved stone models of the fortress, tricolour cockades, patriotic prints, and souvenir pikes that a canny observer might have concluded the true French genius unleashed by the Revolution was not liberty at all but retail. The barricade and the gift shop hand in hand from the very first summer. Historians still argue whether this hopeful interlude, the king in his tricolour cockade, Lafayette on his white horse, the dream of a peaceful constitutional monarchy, was ever real, or whether it was always a mirage, doomed by hunger and suspicion and the king's own quiet unwillingness to accept the new order. Knowing what comes later, the guillotine and the terror and the wars, it is tempting to say the gentle summer of 1789 was a lie. But that is hindsight, and hindsight is cheap. The people who lived that summer did not know the ending, any more than you know yours, and for a few warm weeks they genuinely believed they had won something wonderful and were about to build a fairer world. There is a tenderness in that belief that I would not want to sneer at, even knowing where the road goes. For now, though, on this quiet morning after, none of the darkness has arrived, you rise and stretch your aching body and step out into a Paris that has just done the impossible, and you go to find your breakfast. And because the rest of our night together will move away from cannon and crowds and back toward the small, warm, human texture of ordinary life in this extraordinary year, let us start with the most ordinary and most important question of all, the one that has haunted this whole story from its first minute. What exactly does a person in Paris in 1789 actually eat? The answer, overwhelmingly, is bread. And I do not just mean that bread is important. I mean that bread is quite literally most of what passes your lips in a day. For a working Parisian, bread is not a side dish or an accompaniment. It is the meal, the foundation, the thing that fills the belly, and the estimates from the time are staggering. A labourer might eat 2 or even 3 pounds of bread a day, drawing the great bulk of his calories from it. Everything else, a little cheese, an onion, a handful of beans, a scrap of salt pork on a good day, a bowl of thin soup, is there mainly to make the bread go down. When you understand that bread is not part of the diet but very nearly the whole of it, you finally understand, in your gut, why its price could topple a kingdom. Your kitchen, if you can call it that, is barely a kitchen at all. In a cramped garret there may be no proper hearth, only a small stove or a brazier, and cooking is a smoky, awkward business. Many of the poor do not really cook so much as assemble bread, cheese, whatever can be bought ready-made from a stall, and a great deal of what a Parisian eats is bought hot in the street, because it is cheaper to buy a bowl of soup from a cellar than to buy the fuel to make your own. The city is full of these small food sellers, women with cauldrons of soup, men frying things, vendors of roasted chestnuts and apples, sellers of milk carried warm from cows kept improbably in the middle of the city, and the water sellers whose watercress and fresh greens brighten a monotonous plate. Meat is a luxury, and a rare one for the poor. When you do eat it, it is likely the cheap cuts, offal, tripe, a pig's trotter, the parts the rich discard, and it is likely to appear in a stew or a soup where a little can be stretched a long way. The idea of a plate heaped with roast beef is a fantasy from another floor of the building, the grand apartments below where the well-off eat in a manner that would make your eyes water. This is the other thing to hold on to about food in 1789, the gulf between the tables. In the same city, on the same day, one man dips stale bread into water while a few streets away a financier sits down to a dozen dishes, and both of them consider their meal perfectly normal. The revolution was, among many other things, an argument between those two tables. To drink you have wine, though wine flatters it. The cheap stuff sold in the cabarets and taverns is thin, sour, watered and cheap precisely because, before the customs gates burned, it was the untaxed wine smuggled or hauled in that a working man could afford. Wine matters enormously, and not merely for pleasure. Remember that the water is dangerous, so wine, even bad wine, is in a real sense safer to drink. And it is also warmth and courage and forgetting and company. The tavern, the guinguette just outside the old customs wall where the wine was cheapest, is the working Parisian's parlour, club and news office all at once. A smoky room where you drink and argue and sing and, in this particular year, plot. Here is a genuine historical detail that delights me. Those cheap drinking gardens, the guinguettes, clustered just outside the customs barrier precisely because the wine there escaped the hated city tax, which meant that generations of Parisians developed the habit of walking out to the very edge of the city to get pleasantly drunk more cheaply, an entire culture of weekend leisure shaped, at bottom by tax avoidance. When those toll gates burned in July, it was not only a political act, it was, for many, a deeply personal one about the price of a glass. A quirky tidbit. Coffee, that fashionable drug of the cafes where the revolution was talked into being, was itself a fairly recent arrival, and the coffee house had transformed Parisian life by giving people a sober, buzzing, wide-awake place to gather and argue, as opposed to the tavern's drowsy fog. It is not entirely a joke to say that the revolution was fueled by caffeine as much as by ideals, a movement of sleepless, over-caffeinated young men reading pamphlets aloud in coffee houses has a very particular energy, and you can taste it in the frantic prose of the time. And a light joke, since we are on the subject of the table, the French, even in the middle of overthrowing their entire social order, remained so serious about food that the collapse of the aristocracy threw hundreds of skilled private chefs out of work all at once, and many of them, needing a living, opened public eating houses to sell their art to anyone with coin. So one of the lasting gifts of the revolution to the world was, of all things, the modern restaurant, born partly from unemployed noble cooks deciding that if they could no longer feed a marquis, they would feed the paying public instead. Liberty, equality, and a very good dinner. Historians still argue whether the food crisis was truly the deepest cause of the revolution or merely its trigger, whether hunger made the powder or only lit it. And, as with so much this evening, the honest answer is that you cannot fully separate the two. But stand in your garret with your 2 pounds of bread and your cup of sour wine, and the argument feels academic. You're not thinking about causes. You're thinking about supper, as people mostly do in every century, which is exactly why supper, in 1789, turned out to matter more than kings. Let us follow you to work now in the calmer weeks of that late summer, because the working life of Paris in 1789 is a marvel that deserves a slow, sleepy tour, and understanding it will tell you why the city both needed the revolution and feared it. Paris, I said before, is a city of hands, and those hands are organised into a dense ancient web of guilds and trades. The corporations, each one a jealous little kingdom governing who may practice a craft, how they are trained, and what they may charge. To become a master baker, or locksmith, or joiner, or hatter, you must pass through years of apprenticeship and journeyman labour, and then, in theory, produce a masterpiece to prove your skill, the very origin of the word, and pay handsomely for the privilege of joining the guild. If you are a journeyman, a companion, your days are long, and your independence is thin. You work in the master's shop, often live under his roof, eat at his table, and labour from the first light to the last 6 days a week. With the great pause of Sunday and the surprising number of saints' days and holy festivals that dot the calendar and give even the poor their scattered rest. The pace of work follows the sun and the seasons, not a clock, and the workshop is a small, close world of masters, journeymen, apprentices, and the master's family, all tangled together in a way that can feel like a family or like a prison, depending on the master and the day. The variety of trades is genuinely dizzying, and I find it one of the most soothing things to contemplate as you drift towards sleep. The sheer number of specific, skilled human tasks that had to be performed by particular pairs of hands to keep a great city alive before machines. There were not merely shoemakers, but separate makers of the soles and the uppers, not merely one kind of woodworker, but joiners and turners and carvers and gilders and makers of nothing but chairs, button makers and lace makers and makers of artificial flowers, men who did nothing but blacken and polish, and women who did nothing but launder the fine linens of the rich in the cold. Water of the Seine until their hands cracked. Every object in your world passed through named, calloused, particular hands. Nothing was anonymous. Everything was made by someone you could, in principle, have gone and watched at their bench. Here is a genuine historical detail that surprises most people. The working women of Paris were absolutely central to this economy, not a footnote to it. Whole trades were female: seamstresses, the couturière, the flower sellers, the market women, the laundresses, the fruit and vegetable vendors, and these women were not shy, sheltered creatures, but tough, organised, sharp-tongued, and, when roused, genuinely fearsome participants in the life of the city, as the powerful would learn to their cost that October. The image of the passive 18th century woman is a fantasy of the drawing room. The woman of the Paris streets was a force, a quirky tidbit for you. The wigmakers and hairdressers of Paris formed a small economy all their own, because the towering, powdered, absurd hairstyles of the fashionable required daily professional labour and vast quantities of flour-based powder. Yes, flour, the same flour that made the bread, so that in a year of famine, there was a genuine bitter public anger at the sight of aristocrats wearing on their heads the very grain the poor could not afford to eat. When people are starving, a powdered wig is not a fashion statement, it is a provocation, and a light joke freely offered from the workbench. The guild system was so obsessively territorial that disputes over which trade had the right to make a particular object could drag on for years in the courts. Cabinet makers versus carpenters, cobblers versus the menders of old shoes, so that some of the fiercest legal battles in old Paris were not about liberty or justice at all, but about who was legally allowed to attach a heel. The revolution would sweep the guilds away within a couple of years in the name of freedom of enterprise, and a great many masters who cheered the fall of the Bastille were considerably less enthusiastic when the mob of freedom came for their comfortable monopolies too. Everyone loves a revolution until it reaches their own front door. You bend to your bench then, and the hours pass in the old rhythm of the hands, and the summer light moves slowly across the floorboards. There is comfort in the work, whatever its hardships, the comfort of skill, of making, of a task your body knows. And there is anxiety in it too, because the whole delicate web of Parisian trade depends on the city being fed and calm and full of customers with coin, and in this uncertain year none of those things can be counted on. A frightened rich man does not order new furniture. A hungry city does not buy artificial flowers. Revolution is bad for the luxury trades, and Paris is, above all, a city of luxury trades. Historians still argue whether the ordinary craftsmen of Paris were natural revolutionaries or reluctant ones. Whether the tradesmen who filled the ranks of the sans-culottes wanted to overturn society or merely wanted bread, work and a fair price, and were radicalized only when those simple things were denied them. The truth once again resists a tidy answer. Most people in most times do not want to remake the world. They want to be left alone to do their work and feed their families. It is only when that modest wish becomes impossible that ordinary people pick up pikes, and in 1789, for a great many Parisians, the modest wish had indeed become impossible, and so the workbench and the barricade turned out to be nearer neighbours than anyone had imagined. If you want to feel the true pulse of Paris, you must go, as everyone must, to Les Halles, the vast central marketplace that has been the belly of the city for 600 years, and I want to walk you through it slowly in the cool of an early morning, because there is no better place to understand how the city fed itself, and who really held its streets. Les Halles is not a building so much as a district, a dense knot of covered markets and open squares and spilling stalls near the centre of Paris, and from before dawn it roars with life. Carts rumble in from the countryside loaded with cabbages and carrots, apples and pears, live chickens and dead ones, fish still smelling of the sea, butter and eggs and cheese, and great sacks of the grain and flour on which everything depends. The market is ruled in practice by the market women, and above all by the fishwives, the poissardes, who are among the most famous characters in all of old Paris. These are women of ferocious independence and legendary sharp tongues, organised, proud, and utterly unafraid, who by long custom held a special, almost official role in the life of the city. They were the ones who, by tradition, would go to congratulate the Queen on the birth of a royal child, and they were the ones you did not, under any circumstances, wish to anger. Their language was so vividly, creatively coarse, that talking like a fishwife entered the language as a description of magnificent, unstoppable, obscene eloquence. In a market, these women were a power, and in a revolution, as October would prove, they were a force that could shake a throne. Let me now plant a seed for you, because it flowers later that very year and it belongs here among the market women. In early October of 1789, with bread still scarce and the king still dithering at Versailles, it was the women of the Paris markets, these same fishwives and vendors and laundresses, who gathered in there. Thousands seized whatever weapons they could and marched the 12 miles out to Versailles in the rain to confront the king and queen directly and demand bread. Thousands of women walking on the palace of the Sun King, dragging cannon through the mud, and they did not go home empty-handed. They brought the royal family back to Paris with them, essentially as hostages of the people, installed in the Tuileries Palace where the city could keep an eye on them. It was the market women, not the philosophers, who physically dragged the monarchy into the grasp of the people. Hold that image as you fall asleep, an army of the hungry, in aprons, changing the course of a nation on foot in the rain. Here is a genuine historical detail about the market that I love. Prices at Les Halles, especially for bread and grain, were watched with an intensity that is hard for us to imagine, and there existed an old popular idea of a just price, a fair price that custom and morality demanded, quite separate from whatever the market would bear. When merchants or bakers were believed to be charging more than the just price, or hoarding to drive prices up, the people did not always simply pay or go without. Sometimes they practiced what historians call the taxation populaire, seizing the goods and selling them off themselves at the price they deemed fair and handing the money to the astonished merchant. It was not quite theft and not quite riot. It was the crowd enforcing its own moral economy with its own hands. A quirky tidbit. Among the goods of Les Halles were the flowers, and the flower sellers of Paris were a beloved fixture, brightening the grey and brown city with colour. But flowers, of course, are a luxury, and there is something poignant in the fact that even in the leanest year, in a city where bread ate 90% of a wage, someone still bought flowers and someone still sold them, because the human need for a little beauty does not switch off simply because the harvest failed. People have always found a coin for a flower even when they could barely find one for bread, and I do not think that is foolishness. I think it is one of the better things about us. And a light joke among the cabbages, the fishwives' reputation for terrifying. Unfiltered speech was so well established that politicians and pamphleteers of the Revolution would actually publish fake speeches in the voice of the market women, complete with mangled grammar and salty abuse, as a popular form of political satire. so that some of the earliest revolutionary propaganda was essentially educated men doing an impression of the very women they were slightly afraid of. Imitation, in this case, was the sincerest form of nervousness. Historians still argue whether the market women's march on Versailles was a spontaneous eruption of hunger or a movement quietly, steered by revolutionary agitators using the women as a shield, calculating that soldiers would hesitate to fire on a crowd of mothers, and the sources, as ever, can be read both ways. But whatever hands helped push it along, no one who studies that October doubts that the anger of the women was entirely real, rooted in the entirely real emptiness of their children's stomachs. You leave the market as the sun climbs, your small purchases in your basket, and you carry with you the knowledge, still only a summer's premonition, that the women haggling over cabbages around you are not to be underestimated by anyone, least of all a king. Come back with me now to your lodging, to the tall, narrow house and the dark stair, because I promised you a slow tour of ordinary life, and there is nothing more ordinary or more revealing than where and how a person sleeps. I told you at the start that these houses are stacked by wealth, the rich near the street and the poor near the sky. And this vertical geography of class is one of the strangest features of old Paris, a place where a duke and a laundress might share a single front door and a single staircase, and pass each other on the steps every day, the one descending in silk to a waiting carriage, the other climbing wearily to a garret with a bucket of coal. The rich and the poor were not yet sorted into separate neighbourhoods as they would later be. They were stacked on top of one another, and the whole social order was quite literally a matter of which floor you lived on. Your own room is small and sparsely furnished, and every object in it is precious because every object was expensive. Remember, all of it made by hand. There is the bed, which may be the single most valuable thing you own, a wooden frame strung with rope and topped with a mattress stuffed with straw. Or if you're lucky, wool or feathers. There is perhaps a chest for your few clothes, a table, a stool or two, a crucifix or a cheap print on the wall, a candlestick, a jug and basin, a pot for cooking and a pot for the night. That may be very nearly the whole inventory of your worldly goods, and when you die it will be listed by a notary in careful detail, because even the poor left estate inventories, and it is from those very lists that historians know what was in rooms like yours. Light is a genuine daily problem, and it shapes the whole rhythm of your life in a way that is hard for us. Drowning in electric light to feel. Candles are expensive, made of tallow if you are poor, rendered animal fat which smokes and stinks and gutters, or of beeswax if you are rich. Clean and bright and far beyond your means. Because light costs money, you rise and sleep with the sun far more than we do. The long dark hours of a winter evening are spent in near blackness or by the flicker of a single mean flame, and the idea of reading late into the night is, for most, an unaffordable fantasy. This is why the lengthening days of summer are a genuine economic relief, and the short days of winter a genuine hardship. Sunlight is free, and everything else that lets you see is not. Heat is the same story told colder. Firewood and charcoal are costly, hauled into the city and taxed at those hated gates, and a poor family may spend a shocking share of its income simply on the fuel to keep from freezing in the terrible winters, like the one just passed when the Seine froze and the price of everything soared. In the worst cold, people crowd together for warmth, share beds, huddle in the cheap heat of taverns and churches, and still they die. Every hard winter carried off the old and the weak and the newborn. Quietly, in numbers we would find unbearable, and they had learned grimly to expect. Here is a genuine historical detail. The very poor often did not have a room at all, but rented merely a bed, or even a share of a bed, or a corner of a floor in a crowded lodging house, sleeping in shifts or packed together with strangers, so that the privacy we take for granted, a room of one's own, was itself a small luxury. To have a door you could close, and a space that was yours, however wretched, was to be doing better than a great many of your neighbours. A quirky tidbit to smile at, because glass was expensive and windows were taxed in some times and places, and because the streets were dark and dangerous at night, the world after sunset simply belonged to a different and smaller set of people. The watch, the criminals, the revellers, the sick, and ordinary respectable life largely shut down with the light. The night was not a time you filled with activity, it was a thing you endured until morning, behind a bolted door, which makes the sleepless, torch-lit, bell-ringing nights of that revolutionary July all the more extraordinary. For the city to be awake and moving in the dark was itself a sign that the normal, Order of the world had come undone, and a light joke as you settle onto your imaginary straw. The bedbug, the flea, and the louse were such constant, universal companions of 18th century sleep, from the garret to the palace, that they were among the few truly democratic institutions in all of France, biting the Duke on the first floor and the laundress on the 6th with perfect egalitarian indifference. Liberty and equality were still being argued over in the assembly. The fleas had achieved fraternity generations earlier. Historians still argue whether ordinary Parisians of this era slept in one long stretch as we do, or in the older pattern of 2 sleeps, a first and a second slumber with a quiet waking hour between them for prayer or talk or love, and the evidence is tangled and much debated. But whatever the pattern, sleep in 1789 was a shallower, colder, more crowded, more interrupted thing than the deep private oblivion you are drifting toward right now. In your warm bed, with your soft light and your fan humming, comforts that not even the King of France in all his frozen glittering palace could have fully imagined. Rest a moment in that thought and in your own good fortune before we move on. Let us talk about how you look, and how you keep yourself, because appearance in 1789 is a language everyone can read, and in a revolutionary year it becomes a language that can save you or condemn you. I've mentioned the great divide of the breeches, the culotte, the tight knee-length trouser of the gentleman, worn with silk stockings and buckled shoes, versus the long, loose trousers of the working man, the pantalon from which the sans-culottes take their name. But the whole of your clothing tells your story at a glance, and everyone is fluent in reading it. The fabric, the cut, the cleanliness, the colours, the hat, the shoes, all of it announces your rank before you open your mouth, in a society far more rigidly marked by dress than our own. The working Parisian's wardrobe is small, practical and hard-worn, a shirt or chemise of coarse linen worn next to the skin, a wool jacket and trousers, a waistcoat, sturdy shoes or wooden-soled clogs, a hat — every man wears a hat — and for the cold, whatever extra layers can be scraped together. Clothes are expensive and are mended, patched, turned, handed down and finally sold as rags, because cloth has real value and nothing is thrown away while a scrap of use remains. There is a thriving trade in second-hand clothing, and many of the poor are dressed entirely in the cast-offs of the better off. Several social ranks visible at once in a single worn coat that began its life on a merchant's back and ended it on a porter's. Cleanliness is a complicated matter, and here you must set aside the modern image entirely. This is an age largely without soap and water bathing as we know it. Full immersion in water was widely distrusted as unhealthy, thought to open the pores to disease, and so people washed mostly by changing their linen. A clean white shirt was the mark of respectability, the visible sign that a person was fresh underneath, whatever lay beneath the outer clothes. The linen did the work our showers do. To have clean linen was to be clean, in the understanding of the day. The rich changed theirs often, the poor as often as they could manage. And the great laundry work of the city, all of it done by hand by armies of women, existed to keep this system of visible cleanliness turning. Perfume and cosmetics, especially among the upper classes, did the rest, masking what water did not remove. The powdered hair I mentioned, white with flour or starch, the rouged cheeks, the scent, the patch of black silk stuck on the face, these were the marks of the aristocracy. And in the year of famine they became marks of shame as much as status, because every wig full of powder was a belly's worth of grain worn as decoration. Fashion, in a hungry city, turned political. To dress plainly and cleanly in honest wool, to wear your own unpowdered hair, to sport the tricolour cockade, became a statement of virtue. To mince about in silk and powder became increasingly a way to get yourself noticed by the wrong people. Here is a genuine historical detail. The red woolen cap, the bonnet rouge or Phrygian cap, would soon become one of the great symbols of the Revolution, worn by the sans-culotte as a badge of liberty, drawn from the ancient cap given to freed slaves in Rome, so that a simple, cheap soft red hat came to carry an enormous weight of meaning. Headgear in these years was never merely headgear. The powdered wig and the red cap were two opposing flags in a war fought partly on the top of people's heads. A quirky tidbit, because appearances mattered so intensely and clothing was so expensive. There was a genuine art to keeping up appearances on almost nothing. A threadbare coat carefully brushed, a frayed cuff turned under, a clean collar over a ragged shirt, the small daily heroism of the respectable poor determined not to be mistaken for beggars. Dignity was stitched and restitched by hand every morning, and it cost real effort to maintain the thin, precious line between poor but decent and destitute, and a light joke to lighten the wardrobe. The aristocratic fashion for enormous, architecturally improbable hairstyles had, in the years before the Revolution, reached such heights. Towers of hair and powder and ornaments sometimes decorated with entire model ships or garden scenes, that ladies reportedly had to kneel on the floor of, their carriages or ride with their heads out the window to fit inside, which is surely the only recorded instance of a hairstyle requiring its own travel arrangements. When the Revolution swept such extravagance away in favour of simple natural hair, one imagines a certain quiet relief among the necks of France. Historians still argue whether the shift toward plainer dress in these years was driven mainly by revolutionary ideology, a deliberate rejection of aristocratic display, or simply by economic necessity, since a bankrupt, hungry country could no longer afford the old extravagance in any case, and virtue and poverty conveniently pointed the same way. As so often, the noble motive and the practical one marched together, and it is hard at this distance to say which was truly leading. But the result was plain to see on every street, a city visibly shedding its powder and silk, dressing down into wool and honest linen, wearing its politics on its hat, and reading every passing stranger's coat like a page of print. You brush your own worn jacket, settle your cockade and step out once more into the reading, watching, talking city. Not all of Paris in 1789 is hunger and cannon smoke, and if I left you with only that, I would be lying to you by omission, because this is also a city that knows, better than almost any city on earth, how to amuse itself. Let me take you, in the soft gold of a summer evening, to the Pont Neuf, the new bridge that is by now the oldest bridge in Paris, and to the boulevards, because the street life of this city is a free theatre that never closes, and it costs nothing to watch. The Pont Neuf is far more than a river crossing. It is a stage, a fairground, a marketplace, and a newsstand all at once, thronged from morning to night with a human circus that has entertained Parisians for 2 centuries. On the bridge and around it you find the true street performers of old Paris, the tooth pullers who work in the open air with a drum to drown the screams, the sellers of quack remedies and miracle cures shouting their impossible promises, the song sellers who will teach you the latest scandalous ballad for a coin, the acrobats and jugglers, the trained dog acts, the men with performing monkeys or a sad dancing bear, the pamphlet hawkers, the shoe shiners, the letter writers who will pen a love note or a petition for, the many who cannot write. It is loud and crooked and full of pickpockets, and it is wonderful, a great churning current of humanity where a poor man can spend an afternoon and be royally entertained without spending a sou he does not have. The theatre proper is a passion of the whole city, high and low alike. Paris has its grand official houses, the Comédie Française for serious drama, the Opera for spectacle and music, but it also has the boulevard theatres, the popular houses along the broad new tree-lined boulevards to the north, where the ordinary Parisian goes for melodrama and comedy and pantomime and blood and thunder tales performed with real feeling for audiences that talk back, cheer, weep, and hurl abuse at the villains. Theatre is not a hushed and reverent thing here. It is participatory, rowdy and alive, and in a year of revolution it becomes charged with politics, so that a line in a play about liberty or tyranny could bring the whole house roaring to its feet. Here is a genuine historical detail. In the years just before the Revolution, the most talked about play in France was Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro, a comedy in which a clever servant outwits and mocks his aristocratic master, and the king himself is said to have tried to ban it, sensing the danger in its laughter, before finally allowing it to be performed to wild acclaim. When a whole nation is laughing at a play about a servant getting the better of a lord, the powerful are right to feel a chill. Comedy in the right year is a loaded weapon, and Paris in the 1780s was laughing at exactly the things that would soon be overturned. In earnest, a quirky tidbit for you. Gambling was an absolute mania in this Paris, from the grand salons where fortunes changed hands over cards to the gutter games of dice, and the wildly popular public lottery, and the Palais-Royal we visited earlier was the beating heart of it, its upper rooms full of gaming tables where men ruined themselves with tremendous style. The same feverish, all-or-nothing energy that people poured into the faro table one suspects was not so very different from the energy they would soon pour into politics. Paris was a city that liked to bet big whether on a card or on a revolution. And a light joke from the boulevards. The tooth-pullers who performed their bloody art on the Pont Neuf employed loud drummers and trumpeters specifically to cover the noise of their patients' agony, which means that the cheerful, brassy music drifting across the bridge on a fine afternoon was, quite often, the sound of someone across the way losing a molar. In old Paris, one man's entertainment was very frequently another man's emergency, and the crowd, it must be said, enjoyed both about equally. There is music everywhere too, though not the ticketed, silent audience music we know. There is the song of the street sellers, each trade with its own cry, a whole city singing its wares. There are the ballads sold and learned on the Pont Neuf, satirical and topical, spreading news and mockery faster than any newspaper. There are the fiddlers in the taverns and the guinguettes, the dancing on a Sunday afternoon in the drinking gardens beyond the wall. For all its hardship, this is a city that sings constantly, and in 1789 the songs turn revolutionary, so that new verses mocking the Queen or celebrating the fall of the Bastille are, on every lip within days, carried by the same ancient machinery of ballad and rumour that has always been the true press of the poor. Historians still argue whether this rich popular culture, the theatre, the songs, the pamphlets, the endless talk, was a genuine engine of the revolution, spreading and shaping its ideas among people who could not read the great political tracts, or whether it merely reflected a mood created by deeper forces of hunger and debt. The debate matters because it is really a debate about how ideas travel among ordinary people, whether through the printed page or through the sung verse. The performed scene, the joke passed hand to hand. My own drowsy guess is that the ballad on the Pont Neuf did more to make a revolution than any philosopher's book, because far more people could sing than could read, and a tune lodges in the heart where an argument never reaches. You linger on the bridge as the light fades and the lamps are lit, humming a tune you only half know, and you carry it home with you into the gathering dark. Sunday in Paris still belongs, for now to the church, and to understand the world you're living in, you must feel how completely the rhythm of the sacred still governs even the most ordinary life, and how strangely, in this 1 year, that ancient rhythm has begun to falter. The Catholic Church in 1789 is woven into every hour of your existence, whether you are devout or indifferent. The bells that ring the hours from 100 steeples are church bells. The calendar that shapes your year is a calendar of saints and feasts. You were baptized by a priest. You will be married by one, you will be buried by one, and the great pauses in your working year. The holy days that give even the poorest, labourer's rest, are gifts of the religious calendar. The church is not a building you visit. It is the air you breathe, the frame around the picture of your whole life. The churches themselves are among the few grand, beautiful, warm interiors a poor person may freely enter, and they serve as far more than places of worship. Notre Dame on its island, the great parish churches, the countless chapels, these are places of shelter and gathering, of art and music and incense, of a beauty otherwise reserved for the rich. On a cold day the church is warmer than your garret. On a lonely one it is full of company. On a frightening one it offers the deep, old comfort of ritual, the same words and gestures your grandparents knew. For people whose lives are hard and short and uncertain, the promise of the church, that this suffering is not the whole story, that there is justice and rest to come, is not a small thing. It is for many the one reliable consolation in a merciless world. And yet, the church in 1789 is also one of the three great estates of the old order, and at its heights it is fabulously, provocatively wealthy, owning vast lands, gathering tithes, its bishoprics handed out as plums to the younger sons of noble families who might never set foot in their dioceses. The gulf that runs through all of French society runs through the church too, between the humble parish priest, the curé, often as poor and as close to the people as any of them, and the aristocratic prince-bishop in his palace. Many of the ordinary priests will side with the revolution, at least at first, because they share the hardships and the hopes of their flocks. The great churchmen will mostly not, and within a year the revolution will turn on the church itself, seizing its lands to pay the nation's crushing debts, and demanding that priests swear loyalty to the new state, a demand that will split French Catholicism down the middle and turn many devout, ordinary people who had cheered the fall of the Bastille bitterly against the revolution they once welcomed. Here is a genuine historical detail that shows how deep the change would cut. The revolution would eventually go so far as to attack the very measurement of time, replacing the ancient Christian calendar with a new revolutionary one, 10-day weeks. Renamed months, the years counted from the birth of the Republic rather than the birth of Christ, in a breathtaking attempt to remake even the days of the week along rational, secular lines. It did not last, and people quietly clung to their Sundays and their saints, but the sheer ambition of it tells you how total the revolutionaries' vision could become. They meant to remake not just the government but the calendar, the measurements, the names of things, the shape of time itself. A quirky tidbit. Among the many trades of old Paris were those that served the vast machinery of faith, the makers of candles for the altars, of rosaries and religious medals, the sellers of holy images, the countless small crafts of devotion, so that religion was not only a spiritual matter but a substantial part of the economy, employing real hands and filling real bellies. When the revolution came for the church, it came, without quite meaning to for all those trades as well, and a good many pious craftsmen found their livelihoods dissolving along with the old certainties, and a light joke, offered gently, the number of saints' days and religious festivals that dotted the old calendar was so generous that a cynical economist of the age might have concluded the single greatest labour benefit the poor of France ever enjoyed came not from any guild or government, but from the Church's inexhaustible supply of holy days requiring rest, so that when reformers later tried to trim the festival calendar for the sake of productivity, they discovered that taking a saint's day away from working people was very nearly as dangerous as raising the price of bread. Never come between a labourer and a legitimate day off, in any century. Historians still argue whether France in 1789 was still a deeply religious society, merely chafing at a corrupt church hierarchy, or whether decades of Enlightenment scepticism had already quietly hollowed out popular faith from within, leaving the outward forms standing over an emptying core. The evidence is genuinely mixed, varying from region to region and street to street, and the truth is probably that faith and doubt lived side by side in the very same hearts, as they so often do. You may be devout, or you may be indifferent, or you may be both by turns, but on this Sunday you hear the bells across the rooftops as you have heard them all your life, and whatever you believe, they mark the hours of your world for a little while longer. When the sun goes down, another Paris wakes, and I want to walk you carefully through the dark city, because the night of 1789 is a genuinely dangerous country, and how it was policed, or not policed, tells you a great deal about the world you are living in. Once the light fails, the streets empty of respectable people and fill with a different population, the watch, the desperate, the criminal, and the few who must be abroad at such an hour. There is street lighting of a kind, lanterns hung on ropes across some streets, lowered on pulleys to be lit and raised again, but it is dim, patchy and easily defeated, and beyond the lit thoroughfares the twisting medieval lanes are as black as a cellar, a labyrinth where a stranger can vanish and a body can lie until morning. The policing of this city is, by our standards, a strange hybrid. There is a night watch, and there is the office of the Lieutenant General of Police, a powerful figure who oversees not just crime but the provisioning of the city, the censorship of books, the surveillance of suspected troublemakers, and a vast network of spies and informers, for the old regime watched its people closely, and the police of Paris were as much about political control as about catching thieves. Yet actual protection on a dark street is thin. You rely far more on your own wits, on locking your door, on not being out when you should be in, on the rough justice of neighbours than on any officer coming to your aid. In a crisis you cry out and hope the street answers. Here is a detail that turns dark and revolutionary at once, and you should know it. The iron brackets that held those street lanterns, the lanterns were sturdy and set at a convenient height, and in the fury of 1789, the crowd discovered a terrible new use for them, hanging hated men from the lantern brackets in summary street executions. "À la lanterne!" "To the lantern!" became a chilling revolutionary cry, and the humble street lamp fixture became an impromptu gallows. The same apparatus meant to bring a little light and safety to the night was turned, in the heat of the rising, into an instrument of the mob's own rough and merciless justice. I tell you this not to frighten you as you drift off, but because it is one of those small, true, chilling details that reveals how thin the membrane was between the ordinary city and the violent one. The criminal underworld of Paris is ancient and organised, with its own slang, its own hierarchies, its own quarters. There are professional thieves and pickpockets. Remember the ones working the Palais-Royal, and there are the more desperate criminals bred by poverty and hunger, and there is a large shifting population of beggars, vagrants, and the unemployed poor, whom the authorities feared and periodically tried to round up. In a year of famine and unemployment, that dangerous floating population swelled, and with it the general fear of crime and disorder, a fear that would feed directly into the violence and suspicion of the revolutionary years. Hunger does not only make people rise up nobly, it also makes some of them steal and makes all of them afraid. A quirky tidbit: the punishment of crime in the old regime was public, brutal, and theatrical, meant to be watched. The pillory, the branding, the breaking on the wheel, the hanging, all performed before crowds as a spectacle and a warning. This is one of the great changes the revolution would bring. The guillotine, whatever its horrors, was actually introduced partly as a reform, a machine meant to make execution swift, equal, and painless. The same quick death for a duke as for a pauper, replacing the older system in which the manner of your execution depended cruelly on your rank. The most infamous device of the Terror began its life as an idea about mercy and equality, which is one of history's grimmer ironies, and a light joke because you need one after the lanterns. The old regime's spies and informers were so numerous and reported such a torrent of overheard café gossip to their superiors that the police archives of pre-revolutionary Paris are one of the richest sources historians have for what ordinary people actually said and thought, so that the surveillance state of Louis XVI, in its zeal to eavesdrop on sedition, accidentally created a magnificent written record of exactly the discontent it was trying to suppress. The snoops, in the end, wrote the people's diary for them. Historians still argue whether crime in Paris genuinely rose in the lead-up to the revolution, or whether it was mainly the fear of crime that rose, the anxiety of a propertied class watching the poor grow more numerous and more desperate, and imagining threats larger than the reality. It is a familiar pattern. Hard times breed not only real disorder, but an even greater dread of disorder, and that dread can drive people to violence and repression out of all proportion, to the actual danger. The line between protecting yourself and terrorizing your neighbor is thin, and fear walks along it easily. You bolt your own door against the dark city, then, and lie listening to the watcher's footsteps and the distant cries, grateful for the flimsy wood between you and the night, as generations before you have lain listening in this same anxious dark. Let us speak softly now about the body and about sickness, and about death, because in 1789 these are near and constant companions in a way our long, medicated, well-fed lives have largely forgotten, and there is a strange comfort in understanding how bravely our ancestors lived alongside them. This is a world before germ theory, before anesthesia, before antibiotics, before nearly everything we mean by medicine. A world where a scratch could kill you, a fever was a coin toss, and childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a healthy young woman could do. Death was not a distant rumour kept behind hospital walls. It was in the house, in the street, an ordinary and expected visitor, and people met it with a familiarity that would break our modern hearts. The medicine of the day, however sincere, could do dreadfully little. Physicians, trained in the classical theory of the four humours, still bled their patients with lancets and leeches, purged them, blistered them, and dosed them with remedies that ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. A doctor was expensive and, for many ailments, no more effective than the folk healer, the herbalist, the wise woman of the neighbourhood with her traditional remedies, or the apothecary with his mysterious jars. For the poor, real medical care was largely out of reach anyway. You relied on home remedies, on prayer, on the neighbourhood's accumulated wisdom, and on the sturdy hope that your own body would win the fight on its own, as remarkably often it did. The hospitals of the age were places to be feared, not sought. Above all, the great Hôtel Dieu beside Notre Dame, the ancient charity hospital that took in the destitute sick and was, by every account, a nightmare of overcrowding, with patients packed several to a bed, the recovering lying beside the dying beside the dead, infection racing through the wards unchecked. To enter such a place was often to catch something worse than you came in with. The hospital was where you went when you had nowhere else and no one to care for you, a last resort of the utterly alone, and its horrors were well enough known that people dreaded it almost as much as the grave. The great killers were the infectious diseases that swept through a crowded, filthy, undernourished city with terrible ease, smallpox above all, which scarred the survivors and killed a dreadful share of the children it touched. The fevers we would now name typhoid and typhus, bred in bad water and lice. The flux, the dysentery that carried off the weak. Tuberculosis, the slow consumption that wasted people away over years. And always, hovering in the collective memory, the older terror of the plague, though its great visitations had by now mostly passed. Against this array of enemies, the ordinary person had almost no defence but a strong constitution and good luck, and the death rates, especially among the very young, were staggering to contemplate. Here is a genuine and hopeful historical detail amid the gloom. This very era was the dawn of the first true victory against an epidemic disease, for the practice of inoculation against smallpox, and soon Jenner's safer vaccination, was spreading through the educated classes of Europe. In exactly these decades, one of the first times humanity found a way to actually prevent a great killer rather than merely pray against it. The light was, in one small corner, beginning to come on, even as the old darkness still reigned nearly everywhere else. Progress and suffering, once again sharing the same year. A quirky tidbit: because so many children died so young, and because a birth was such an uncertain thing, many customs of the age around infancy can seem strange or cold to us, but they were in truth the armour people wore against unbearable and frequent grief. To love carefully, to name a new child after an older one who had died, to hold something back until a baby had survived its most dangerous first years, these were not signs that our ancestors loved their children less than we love ours. They were the bruised habits of people who buried far too many of them, and who had to find some way to keep living and loving in the face of it. And a light joke, offered tenderly, because the subject is heavy. The medical fashions of the age were so enthusiastic about bleeding patients that a running dark joke of the era, and of historians ever since, is that a great many people of the 18th century very probably died not of their diseases, but of their doctors' vigorous attempts to cure them, so that, for a surprising range of common ailments, your single best medical decision in 1789 might well have been to smile politely at the physician, pay his fee, and then quietly do the exact opposite of everything he advised. Sometimes the kindest thing a healer could do was stay home. Historians still argue over just how high the death rates truly were, and how fast they were beginning to fall in these years. As better food in some regions, inoculation, and slowly improving conditions began, here and there, to lengthen lives. But the debate is about degrees of a hardship we can barely imagine. What is not in doubt is that the people who made the revolution did so while living cheek by jowl with death, having buried parents and children and friends, hardened and deepened by loss in ways that gave their hopes and their furies a weight our safer lives seldom know. You say a quiet prayer, perhaps, for your own health and your families, as people did every single night in 1789, and you are grateful, in your bones, simply to have made it once more to the end of another day. Let us turn to gentler things, to children and families, because for all its hardship this is a world full of ordinary love, and the family life of Paris in 1789 has its own quiet warmth that the grand histories rush past on their way to the battles. A working family here is a small economy, every member contributing what they can from a young age. There is little of the long sheltered childhood we know. Children work almost as soon as they are able, running errands, minding younger siblings, helping in the shop, learning a trade at an age when a modern child is still at play, and this is not thought cruel but simply necessary, the way a family survives when every pair of hands must earn its bread. A child of 8 or 10 may already be a genuine economic asset, and a child's labour may be what keeps the whole household above the waterline. Yet do not imagine these homes as joyless. The affection between parents and children in the ordinary homes of old Paris shines through the records wherever the records let us see it, in the tenderness of letters, in the grief of estate inventories that note a dead child's small-kept treasures, in the customs and games and lullabies passed down through generations. People loved their children fiercely, precisely because they might lose them, and the small pleasures of family life, a shared meal, a festival, a song, a name day, a walk on a Sunday, shone all the brighter against the surrounding hardship. Love did not wait for prosperity in 1789. It never has in any age. One custom will strike you as strange, and it is worth understanding. Among the middling and upper classes of Paris, and even some of the working poor, it was extremely common to send newborn babies away to the countryside to be nursed by a hired wet nurse, sometimes for 2 or 3 years before they returned home. A whole industry existed around this. agencies that placed infants with rural nurses, carriers who transported the babies out of the city, and it meant that a great many Parisian children spent their earliest years not with their own mothers, but on a farm miles away. The practice had real dangers. Many infants died far from home in the care of strangers. Reformers, influenced by Rousseau's passionate call for mothers to nurse their own children, were beginning to attack the custom in exactly these years, part of the same great questioning of tradition that was reshaping everything else. Education for the ordinary child is thin and patchy. There is no system of universal schooling. What learning the poor receive comes from the church, charity schools run by religious orders, a parish priest teaching a few letters and the catechism, or from an apprenticeship that teaches a trade rather than a book. Literacy varies enormously. More men can read than women, more city dwellers than country folk, more of the comfortable than the poor. A great many Parisians can read a little, or can sign their name, or can follow a simple text with effort, while true fluency belongs to the educated classes. This is exactly why the spoken and sung culture we spoke of matters so much. The pamphlet read aloud, the ballad, the rumour, because for the majority news and ideas travel through the ear far more than the eye. Here is a genuine historical detail. The revolution would soon make grand plans for free, universal public education as a right of every citizen, a genuinely radical and beautiful idea for its time, though the money and the stability to carry it out would not come for many years. But the dream was born here, in these years of upheaval, out of the recognition that a nation of citizens rather than subjects would need to be a nation that could read, think, and judge for itself. The seeds of the modern schoolroom were planted in the soil of the revolution, even if they took generations to flower. A quirky tidbit: the toys of 18th century childhood, for those who had any, were largely handmade and simple. Wooden dolls, hoops, tops, balls, toy soldiers of lead or wood, marbles, and children played the same games in the Paris gutters that children had played for centuries and would go on playing for centuries more. The great unbroken continuity of childhood running quietly beneath all the noise of kings and revolutions. While their parents stormed the Bastille, the children of Paris were, in the very same weeks, no doubt still spinning tops and skipping and squabbling over marbles, because childhood, blessedly, has always had its own urgent business that no revolution can quite interrupt. And a light joke for the nursery, given how many Parisian babies were shipped off to the countryside to be nursed. One might say that the truly seasoned traveller of 18th century France was not the merchant or the soldier, but the average infant, who could rack up more miles in its first month of life, bundled in a cart to some distant farm, than many an adult peasant would travel in a lifetime of staying put. The babies of Paris were, in their small way, the most well-travelled citizens of the realm, whether they liked it or not. Historians still argue about the true nature of family feeling in this era, whether the sending away of infants and the hardness of child labour reflect a colder, more distant kind of parental love than our own, or whether they were simply the painful compromises of people who loved exactly as we do, but lived under pressures we can scarcely imagine. The older view held that pre-modern parents guarded their hearts against children they expected to lose. The newer view finds warmth and grief and devotion everywhere it looks. My own drowsy conviction leans toward the warmth because love is very old, older than any of the customs that constrained it, and I do not believe the human heart was so different 200 years ago. You picture the children of your imaginary Paris asleep at last, and something in you softens toward the whole hard, hopeful, striving city. Now let us follow the most powerful force in all of revolutionary Paris, more powerful than the king's soldiers, more powerful than the cannon at the Bastille, and that force is not an army but a whisper. It is rumour and news, and the printed word, and I want you to understand how information moved through this city, because in 1789 the control of what people believed slipped out of the hands of the powerful, and once it did, nothing could be put back. For most of the old regime, the crown had held a tight grip on print. Books and newspapers were censored, presses were licensed, and forbidden works had to be smuggled in from abroad or printed in secret. But that grip was already failing before 1789, and in the Great Crisis it shattered completely. When the censorship collapsed, the presses of Paris exploded into life. Pamphlets, newspapers, broadsides, cartoons and libels poured out by the thousand, cheap and fast and utterly uncontrolled, and suddenly anyone with a few sous could buy the latest fiery tract. and anyone with a press could become a voice in the great argument. New newspapers appeared almost weekly, some of them the mouthpieces of men who would become famous or infamous, the young journalists, and agitators who found in this sudden freedom a power they had never dreamed of. Camille Desmoulins, our stuttering hero of the Palais-Royal, became one of them, wielding a pen far more dangerous than the pistol he'd waved on his café table. Words were the true artillery of the revolution, and the presses never stopped firing. But remember that most Parisians could not fully read, and so the printed word reached them transformed. Spoken aloud on every corner and in every café and market, a single pamphlet bought by one literate man might be read aloud to a crowd of dozens, argued over, embellished, and carried away in 100 imperfect memories to be repeated elsewhere. This is how ideas actually travelled, not silently down a page but loudly through the air, mutating as they went so that news and rumour and outright invention blurred together into a single roaring stream. In such a torrent, a lie could outrun the truth easily, and fear could spread faster than either. And fear did spread terribly that very summer, in one of the strangest episodes of the whole revolution, an event so revealing that I must tell it to you even though it happened out in the countryside rather than in your Paris streets. In the weeks after the Bastille fell, a wave of blind panic swept across rural France, a thing historians call the Great Fear. A rumour took hold, vague, baseless, unstoppable, that the aristocrats, in revenge for the revolution, had hired armies of brigands to burn the crops and massacre the peasants. There were no such brigands, there was no such plot. But the rumour, riding on real hunger and real anxiety, leapt from village to village faster than any horse, and terrified peasants armed themselves, and then, finding no brigands to fight, turned their fear and fury on the local chateau, burning the manor houses and, above all, the documents, the hated records of their feudal dues and obligations. Here is the genuine historical weight of it. This countryside panic, born of pure rumour, had enormous real consequences, because it so frightened the noble deputies in the National Assembly that on the famous night of the 4th of August, 1789, in a kind of emotional stampede, they stood up one after another and renounced their ancient feudal privileges, abolishing in a single extraordinary night the whole tangled structure of seigneurial rights that had bound the French peasant for centuries. A rumour about brigands who did not exist helped bring down 1,000 years of feudalism. If you ever doubted that what people believe can be more powerful than what is true, let the Great Fear settle the question. A quirky and slightly chilling tidbit, the speed at which the Great Fear travelled across France. Historians have actually mapped it, tracing the panic spreading along the roads day by day, was astonishing for an age without any fast communication, proof that a sufficiently frightening story needs no telegraph, no printing press, nothing but frightened human beings passing it mouth to mouth at the speed of a walking man. We flatter ourselves that misinformation is a modern disease of our networks and screens, but the peasants of 1789 could spread a baseless panic across a whole country in a fortnight, armed with nothing but their own fear, and a light joke among the whispers, given how much of the revolution ran on rumour, gossip and wildly unreliable pamphlets, a case could be made that the true founding institution of modern France was not the National Assembly, but the neighbourhood busybody. That tireless, unpaid, ever-present figure who knew everything, believed most of it, and told all of it to everyone, and without whom half the great events of 1789 would have lacked their essential fuel. Every revolution, it seems, needs its gossips as much as its philosophers. Historians still argue whether the collapse of censorship and the flood of print truly caused the radicalization of the revolution or merely accompanied it, whether the newspapers led opinion or followed it, whether Desmoulins and his fellow journalists shaped the storm or were merely swept up in it like everyone else. It is once more the ancient question of whether the word makes the deed or the deed makes the word, and once more the honest answer is that they made each other. Endlessly, in a spiral no one controlled, you fall asleep at last in your imaginary garret to the distant sound of a pamphlet being read aloud by torchlight in the street below, the words rising up to your window like smoke, carrying the news of a world remaking itself in real time. As that extraordinary summer wears on toward autumn, the city around you settles into a new and uneasy rhythm, and I want to walk you through what it feels like to live in the strange calm after the storm, when the great events have paused but everyone knows they are not finished. The Bastille is being dismembered stone by stone, its towers coming down under the picks of Palais' workmen, and Parisians stroll out to watch the hated fortress vanish from the skyline, buying their little souvenir stones, marvelling that the thing that loomed over their whole lives is simply, physically, going away. There is a giddiness in the air, a sense of this enormous possibility, mixed with a nervous watchfulness, because no one quite trusts that the danger is past. Out at Versailles, meanwhile, the National Assembly, the gathering of deputies that began this whole crisis in the spring, is doing something that will outlast every barricade and every cannon. It is writing down, in plain and ringing language, the principles of a new world. In late August it issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and I want you to feel the weight of those words, even if, as an ordinary Parisian, you can only half read them. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural rights of man. Law is the expression of the general will. These are not small sentences. They are a hammer taken to the whole foundation of the old order. The idea that some men are born to rule and others born to obey, and once written down and proclaimed they can never be fully unwritten again. For you on the cobblestones, the Great Declaration is at first an abstraction, glimpsed through the same haze of pamphlet and rumour as everything else, but its consequences reach your daily life in 1,000 practical ways over the months to come. The feudal dues renounced on that emotional night of the 4th of August. The promise, however slow to arrive, of equality before the law. The sense, entirely new and intoxicating, that you are not a subject of the king but a citizen of the nation, with rights that are yours by birth rather than gifts to be granted or withdrawn by your betters. It is a shift in the very idea of what a person is, and even if your belly is still empty and your rent still due, something in the way you carry yourself through the streets has changed. You look the world in the eye a little differently now, and yet the old problems have not vanished with the old fortress. The bread is still dear. The harvest of 1789, though better than the ruinous one before, does not end the hunger overnight. The economy, shaken by all this upheaval, throws men out of work and empties the luxury workshops. The king remains at Versailles, and his acceptance of the new order feels grudging and uncertain, and the fear that he might yet call in soldiers to undo everything never fully sleeps. It is precisely this stew of unfinished hunger and unfinished trust that will boil over in October, when the market women make their rainy march to Versailles and drag the royal family back to Paris. But that, as I promised you long ago, is a story just beyond the edge of tonight. Here is a genuine historical detail to hold. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, drafted in that revolutionary summer, would go on to become one of the founding documents of the modern world, its language echoing down through 2 centuries and across every continent, into constitutions and charters and the great human rights declarations of ages the men of 1789 could never have imagined. Whatever horrors the revolution would soon commit, and it would commit terrible ones, it also set loose into the world a set of ideas about human dignity and equality that could never afterward be entirely caged. The summer you have lived through tonight was not only violence and hunger, it was also the birth of some of the noblest words humanity has ever set down. A quirky tidbit. In the flush of that revolutionary summer, the fashion for all things patriotic reached such heights that people gave their children names drawn from the Revolution and antiquity, or tricolour everything, drank from cups painted with the Bastille, and generally turned the whole apparatus of daily life into a wearable, drinkable, usable expression of political enthusiasm, the 18th century's version, one might say, of a nation that could not stop posting about the news, except that here the news was stitched into your waistcoat and painted on your teacup, and a light joke for the changed city. So thoroughly did the fall of the Bastille capture the imagination that within weeks there were Bastille-shaped snuff boxes, Bastille engravings, Bastille songs, Bastille fans, and of course Palais' Bastille stone models, to the point where a weary observer might have wondered whether the true and lasting achievement of the Revolution's first summer was going to be the invention of the themed gift shop. The French had overthrown a fortress and immediately irresistibly begun to merchandise it. Historians still argue whether the summer of 1789 represents the Revolution at its purest and best, the moment of hope and high principle before the descent into faction, war and terror, or whether the seeds of all that later darkness were already visibly present in the very violence that brought the Bastille down, the heads on pikes standing as an early warning of what was to come. It is perhaps the deepest debate of all about the Revolution, And I will not pretend to settle it for you as you drift towards sleep. I will only say that both the hope and the horror were real, and both were present from the start, tangled together in the same crowds and the same hearts, as they so often are in the great turnings of human affairs. And so we come, you and I, to the quiet end of our long day in Paris, and I want to bring you back at last to your small room beneath the eaves, to the window, to the settling dark. Because after all the cannon and the crowds and the burning gates, this is where an ordinary life in 1789 truly ends its day, not on the barricade but at the window, looking out over a city breathing itself to sleep. The July heat has softened into the cool of the evening. The bells have rung their last hour. Below you the streets are emptying, the lamps swaying gently on their ropes, the last footsteps fading, and the enormous restless animal of Paris is for a few hours growing still. You have lived through the beginning of the largest thing that will ever happen in your lifetime, and tomorrow you will get up and buy bread, because that is what people do in every age on the morning after history. I have tried tonight to show you not the revolution of the textbooks, the dates, the decrees, the great men in their portraits, but the revolution as it was lived, from below, through the eyes of someone with an empty stomach and raw hands and a straw mattress under the roof. And what strikes me most, looking back over our long day together, is how ordinary the extraordinary really was. The people who stormed the Bastille were not heroes carved from marble. They were cobblers and seamstresses and cabinet makers and market women who were frightened and hungry and brave and cruel by turns, exactly as you or I would be, swept up in something none of them fully understood and none of them could stop. That, I think, is the truest and most humbling lesson of that summer. That history is not made by a different and grander species of person, but by people just like the one you see reflected, faintly in your dark window. The great events up close are almost always a matter of small things, a price chalked on a baker's board, a rumour passed in a bread queue, a leaf pulled from a chestnut tree, a shortage of gunpowder, a frightened man on a high wall making the wrong choice. The revolution did not descend from the sky. It grew up out of the cobblestones, out of the daily texture of ordinary life that we have wandered through together tonight. The food and the work and the sickness and the songs and the whispers. And that is why I wanted to spend our whole night not on the battle, but on the life around it. Because the battle only makes sense once you have felt the life. Here is a last genuine historical detail to carry into sleep. The men and women who lived through 1789 did not know they were living through the French Revolution. That name, that sense of a single great capitalized event, came later from us, looking back and drawing a neat frame around what was, to them, simply a bewildering, terrifying, exhilarating stretch of ordinary days in which the world would not stop changing. They did not have the ending. They only had the morning and the bread to buy and the rumour to weigh and the hope to hold, exactly as you have only your own morning coming, with its own uncertainties. There is a strange kinship in that, across 200 years, the shared condition of living forward, blind into a history that only later acquires a shape. A final quirky tidbit, and then I will let you rest. The date you have lived through tonight, the 14th of July, would become the great national holiday of France, celebrated every year with fireworks and parades and dancing in these very streets, so that the frightened, hungry, improvising crowd of 1789, who thought they were merely trying to find gunpowder before the Germans came, accidentally created the most joyful day in the French calendar. They were looking for ammunition, and they found, without meaning to, a festival that would outlive them by centuries, and a last, gentle joke, because we began with laughter and should end near it too. If any one of those weary, sweating, terrified Parisians of that July could somehow have known that 200 years later people all over the world would be lying comfortably in warm, well-lit rooms, softly drifting off to sleep to the calm retelling of the single most frightening week of their lives, they would surely have been utterly baffled, and then, being Parisian, they would very probably have found a way to sell tickets. History has a long memory, and an even longer sense of humour. Historians still argue over what the revolution finally meant, whether it was a triumph of liberty or a descent into terror, a necessary birth or a needless bloodletting. The dawn of the modern world or a warning about the modern world's dangers, and they will still be arguing long after you and I are both asleep, because the great questions do not close, but you do not need to settle any of that tonight. Tonight you need only rest, safe and warm, 2 centuries and a whole world away from the cobblestones, while the imaginary lamps of old Paris sway gently below your window and the last light fades, and the enormous city, having done the impossible, lays down its head at last as you are about to lay down yours. So let the city grow quiet now. Let the streets empty of their carts and their crowds, their sellers and their soldiers. Let the last cartwheel fall silent on the cobblestones, and the last voice fade from the last café, and the great bells hang still in their dark towers. The long day is over. There is nothing left to buy, nothing left to fear, nothing left to do but rest. Feel the warm evening settle over the rooftops of old Paris like a soft grey blanket drawn slowly up. The lamps sway gently on their ropes, small and golden and calm. Somewhere a shutter closes. Somewhere a mother hushes a child. The river slides by, dark and slow and patient, carrying the day away toward the sea, and taking with it every worry, every hunger, every sharp and frightening thing, until nothing is left along its banks but stillness and the soft silver of the moon on the water. You are safe, you are warm. The hard cobblestones are far away, and the cold garret and the long queue and the smoke and the shouting, all of it 200 years and a whole gentle world away from where you lie now. There is nothing you must carry into sleep. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your hands unfold. Let your breath grow slow and deep and easy, in and out, soft as the river, quiet as the moon. The people of that faraway city are sleeping now too, every one of them, the brave and the frightened, the hungry and the hopeful, all of them laid down at last in the kind dark, their long day finished, their story handed gently on to us. And now it is your turn to set it down. Close your eyes. Let the golden lamps blur and dim. Let old Paris fade softly into the warm and the dark, and let yourself drift, easy and unafraid, down into sleep. Rest now. You have come the whole long way. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.